They laughed when you bought that broken boat, the dockmaster barked, letting the pier hear. Single dad with a rust bucket. What's next? A crown? Laughter rippled off polished rails. A woman in a white blazer, Maris Ashbourne, chair of the marina board, watched like she owned the tide. He's blocking paying members, she said. Move him. The single dad didn't argue. He folded the receipt, stared at the condemned hull, and started untying the lines as if the noise wasn't real. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Because beneath the jokes sat something uglier, rent he couldn't outrun, a kid who still believed, and a coastline that didn't care about status. They didn't know that weeks from now the Coast Guard would knock, asking for him by name, not his paycheck. The mockery sharpened. Maris snapped for security, and 2 men stepped in, not to help, just to remind him he didn't belong. Phones lifted, capturing his worst day like a show. He gave them nothing. No pleading, no fury, just a slow breath, steady hands, and eyes that stayed on the boat. Vindication wasn't here yet, but it was coming. The paint blistered under his palm, and a red condemned tag swung from the cleat like a verdict. To Maris, it was trash near her gleaming slips. To Rowan Hale, it was a last door that hadn't slammed. He'd brought his son, Elliot, because there was no one else. The boy hovered close with a dented lunchbox, tracking every laugh. Rowan felt the old instinct rise. Take the hit so your child doesn't have to. Someone muttered, "Hope it floats longer than his custody plan." Rowan shifted, putting his body between the voices and the boy. "Hey," he said softly, "eyes on me. We're okay." He wasn't okay. The rent notice was folded in his pocket. The fridge at home was half empty. Dock work paid in hours, not mercy. But panic spread fast, and Rowan had learned, years ago, that calm could be a shield. Maris approached, perfume slicing through salt air. "You can't work on that here," she said, smooth and final. "Insurance won't allow amateurs." Rowan glanced at the cracked transom, then at the yachts shining like trophies. "I'm not working on yours," he said. "I bought mine." Her smile tightened. It wasn't the boat that offended her. It was the word mine. "Security," she repeated. "Make sure he doesn't loiter." One guard hesitated, eyes flicking to Elliot. That tiny pause told Rowan everything. Even here, the sight of a child could bend a script. They herded Rowan off the main pier and shoved the paperwork into his hands like it was dirty. Maris walked away already on her phone, talking about standards and image. Rowan guided Elliot toward the maintenance yard, the place Power never looked. Behind fuel drums and stacked pallets, the air changed. Diesel, metal, the thrum of generators, the honest clank of work. A mechanic named Santi leaned out from an engine bay. "You're the guy who bought the condemned skiff?" Rowan nodded. Santi let out a low whistle. "Either brave or broke." Rowan's mouth twitched. "Both." He climbed onto the deck and listened. Not to the laughter fading behind him, those voices were already bored, but to the hull's complaints, a creak here, a hollow note there. His mind mapped stress points without effort. Reinforce ribs, replace fasteners, seal seams. He didn't announce it. He moved. His gloves were old, stitched and restitched, the kind you kept when you trusted them in worse places than a marina. A pale scar ran along his wrist, half hidden when he flexed, and Elliot had asked about it once. Rowan had only said, "Work," then changed the subject. Now, as he checked the bilge pump wiring and measured the draft with a scrap of line, his hands looked too sure for a man everyone called a nobody. Even Santi paused, eyebrows lifting, like he'd just seen the outline of some buried history inside. Elliot knelt by a rusted hinge. "Can I help?" Rowan handed him a small brush and solvent. "Clean the bolts. Slow." The boy's face lit like he'd been given a job that mattered. Rowan watched, and something in his chest loosened. Just enough to breathe. He kept his gaze on the stern, thinking of reefs outside the breakwater and storms that turned rich toys into wrecks. He told himself he was rebuilding a boat to fish, to earn, to survive. But the truth underneath was steadier. He was rebuilding his son's faith, plank by plank. Out on the main pier, Maris Ashbourne's laughter carried once more, sharp as gull cry. Rowan didn't look up. He set his wrench to the first bolt and turned, steady, exact, like the sea was already counting down. The wrench stopped turning only when the light shifted from gold to gray, and the yard's generators hummed louder than the laughter from the main pier. Rowan wiped his hands on a rag, already black with oil, feeling Elliot's eyes on him. "You okay?" the boy asked quietly. Rowan nodded. "Yeah, long road, that's all." Across the yard, Santy leaned against a tool chest. "You planning to berth that thing here?" he called. "Board's not going to like it." "They don't have to," Rowan replied. "I just need access to water." What he didn't say was that access cost money. Permits, temporary docking fees, safety inspections designed to discourage anyone without a polished hull and a membership badge. As if summoned by the thought, Maris Ashbourne reappeared at the edge of the labor zone, heels clicking against concrete. She didn't step fully inside. People like her never did. "You've been informed," she said crisply, "that all restoration work requires approval, insurance liability, environmental compliance, security clearance." Rowan stepped down from the boat, placing himself subtly between her and Elliot again. "It's a private purchase, I'll handle it." Her eyes flicked over his boots, the patched knees of his jeans. "Handle it?" She let out a soft laugh. "You can barely afford to dock it." The words hit, but he kept his breathing slow. "I'll manage." Maris studied him like he was a stain that wouldn't scrub out. "You have 48 hours to remove that vessel from this marina," she said, "or we'll tow it ourselves." Elliot stiffened. Rowan felt it before he saw it. "Understood," he answered evenly. She turned, satisfied, already dialing someone. The message was clear. Power didn't shout when it could schedule. Silence settled after she left. Santy shook his head. "She's serious. I know." "You got somewhere else to take it?" Rowan glanced at the breakwater beyond the slips. The old municipal ramp on the far side of the harbor was barely maintained. Shallow, debris-laced waters that luxury yachts avoided. No prestige, no polish, just tide and risk. "Yeah," he said finally, "I've got somewhere." They worked faster after that. Rowan stripped out rotted floorboards with controlled efficiency. He reinforced ribs with salvaged marine-grade aluminum he'd sourced cheaply weeks ago. Every measurement precise. Every bolt torqued just right. Santy watched in quiet curiosity. "You'd done this before?" Santy asked at one point. Rowan didn't look up. Something like it. The understatement hung in the air. As evening deepened, harbor patrol sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Routine traffic control, nothing urgent. But Rowan's head tilted instinctively, calculating wind direction, current pull, the subtle shift in pressure. "You hear that?" Santy asked. "Yeah." "Storm fronts early." Rowan nodded once. He'd seen the forecast models. He'd seen the pressure drop hours before the public bulletin went out. Elliot wiped sweat from his forehead. "Dad, why are we adding extra reinforcement on the bow?" Rowan paused, considering how much to say. "Because shallow water lies," he replied. "Looks calm, hides teeth." The boy absorbed that, filing it away. By midnight, they'd moved the boat to the municipal ramp. It wasn't glamorous, cracked concrete, flickering sodium lights, but no one there cared what you owned. As Rowan secured the lines, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He stepped aside and answered. "Yeah?" a clipped voice responded. "Mr. Hale, this is Marina Compliance. You're in violation of Section—" He ended the call without speaking. Santi blinked. Bold. Rowan slipped the phone back into his pocket. No point arguing. He crouched by Elliot. "Listen, tomorrow might get loud. People don't like being told no." Elliot looked toward the distant lights of the luxury marina. "Are we going to lose the boat?" Rowan held his son's gaze. "Not if I can help it." There it was again. That calm certainty that didn't match his bank account. He checked the fuel lines one more time, adjusted the bilge pump, installed a secondary manual override that most casual boat owners wouldn't even think about. "Why 2 systems?" Elliot asked. "Because when one fails," Rowan said quietly, "you don't get a second chance." Wind picked up off the water, slicing colder now. Whitecaps flickered beyond the breakwater. On the far side of the harbor, music from the marina's private lounge drifted faintly across the dark. Laughter, glasses clinking, a world insulated from tide charts. Rowan secured the final latch and stepped back, studying the boat. It no longer looked condemned, it looked intentional. And somewhere beyond the horizon, pressure was building. Before we go further, subscribe with the bell on, because this isn't just about a boat. It's about what happens when power underestimates preparation. Rowan didn't know yet how soon that preparation would matter. But the sea did. The wind didn't ease overnight. It pressed against the small municipal ramp like a warning no one else seemed to hear. Rowan was already awake before dawn, tightening the last bracket beneath the bow light, while Elliot slept curled under a blanket in the truck. The sodium lamp above them flickered, casting long, restless shadows over aluminum plating that hadn't existed 2 days ago. He ran his palm along the reinforced hull and listened. Not with his ears, with memory. Pressure drop, cross-current shift, the way shallow water amplified impact instead of absorbing it. A pickup rolled in behind him. Harbor Patrol trainee, barely mid-20s, stepped out adjusting his cap. The name patch read Calder. "You can't stay here long," Calder said, but his tone lacked authority, more curious than confrontational. Rowan nodded without looking up. "Just finishing." Calder circled the boat slowly. "That thing was tagged condemned last month. Tags come off." Calder crouched, tapping the reinforced seam with a knuckle. "You changed the rib alignment." Rowan paused. Most people wouldn't notice that. "Needed redistribution," he answered. Calder stood, studying him now instead of the boat. "You marine trade?" "Dock mechanic." "That all?" Rowan's jaw shifted slightly. "That's enough." The trainee let it drop, but something had shifted in the air, recognition without understanding. Calder walked back to his truck but didn't leave right away. He watched as Rowan recalibrated the bilge intake to sit higher than standard placement. Not amateur work. Elliot stirred, rubbing his eyes. "Is it worse today?" Rowan checked the horizon. Low clouds, fast-moving. Whitecaps punching closer to the harbor mouth. "Storms earlier than forecast," he said. Calder leaned against his door. "Marina boards still hosting their regatta preview this afternoon. Ashbourne doesn't cancel for weather." Rowan almost smiled at that. Almost. Water cancels for no one, he replied. By late morning, the harbor changed tone. Luxury vessels remained docked, but crews were scrambling quietly, double-checking lines, topping fuel, adjusting fenders. Rowan noticed shortcuts. One yacht refueled too close to open water. Another ignored crosswind angles when securing. Money bought boats. It didn't buy instinct. Elliot pointed toward the marina's main slips. Why aren't they worried? Because they think big boats equal safety, Rowan said. And they don't? Rowan met his son's eyes. Size doesn't beat physics. The wind surged again, stronger this time, sending spray over the municipal dock. Rowan secured an extra tether line and checked his secondary pump. Calder returned, walking faster now. Weather Service just upgraded the advisory. Rowan's gaze sharpened. To what? Coastal storm warning, breakwater impact risk. There it was. He had expected it. Across the harbor, and the regatta preview banners snapped violently in the wind. Music cut off mid-note. Crew members ran along polished decks. Then came the first real sound. Not thunder. Impact. A hollow crack from the far side of the breakwater. Calder swore under his breath. Jet ski out past the markers. Rowan was already moving. Stay here, he told Elliot. The boy grabbed his sleeve. Dad, I'll be right back. Calder lifted his radio, voice tightening. Unidentified watercraft down near shallow zone. Possible rollover. Another impact echoed, closer. Rowan's eyes scanned the channel automatically. Distance, angle, debris drift. Luxury marina security boats attempted to launch, but their deeper drafts forced them to slow near the shoals. Too shallow, Calder muttered. They'll ground. Rowan's gaze cut to his own vessel. Low draft, reinforced bow, a manual override systems. He stepped toward it without announcing why. Calder noticed. You can't just... She's lighter, Rowan said calmly. Less draw. You certified? Rowan didn't answer. Across the harbor, chaos escalated. A yacht siren blared. Someone shouted a name carried faintly on the wind. Ashbourne? Calder's radio crackled. Board chair's daughter missing. Repeat, missing. The words settled heavy in the air. Rowan felt the shift immediately. This wasn't about permits anymore. Calder swallowed. Coast Guard's en route, but they're 10 minutes out. Rowan was already untying lines. You don't have clearance, Calder said, but the protest sounded weak even to him. Clearance won't matter in 5, Rowan replied. Elliot stood frozen at the truck, eyes wide but not panicked. He trusted what he saw. Calder hesitated, then lowered his voice. If you're wrong, I'm not. No arrogance, just fact. Another wave slammed the breakwater, sending spray high into gray sky. Rowan stepped onto his boat and fired the engine. It responded immediately, steady, controlled. Calder stared at the reinforced hull cutting cleanly through water that stalled larger vessels. You've done this before, the trainee said softly. Rowan adjusted throttle with minimal motion. Something like it. Behind them, marina elites gathered along the pier, panic replacing polish. Among them, Maris Ashbourne gripped the railing, face drained of color. For the first time since she'd mocked him, she wasn't looking down at him. She was looking toward him, and the sea kept rising. The engine cut through the chop with a low, steady growl as Rowan angled toward the breakwater. Spray hit his face in sharp bursts, cold and bracing, but his grip never shifted. Behind him, the municipal ramp shrank into gray blur while the marina's polished slips dissolved into chaos. Calder's voice crackled over the handheld radio he'd shoved at Rowan last second. Coast Guard 3 minutes out. Debris field expanding. Breakwater breach confirmed. Rowan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He adjusted course by instinct, not sight, reading the water's texture instead of its color. The shallow zone near the shoals churned differently, waves folding inward where submerged rock hid just beneath the surface. Luxury rescue boats had tried to approach. He could see one now, stalled and reversing awkwardly to avoid grounding. Too heavy, too slow. "Dad." Elliot's voice echoed faintly in his mind, though the boy was safely behind him now. "Focus." Another impact boomed, followed by the unmistakable scrape of fiberglass against rock. Rowan throttled down slightly and let the current pivot his bow at an angle most would never risk. The reinforced plating beneath him absorbed the shock of hidden turbulence without flinching. A bright flash of overturned hull came into view beyond the broken markers. Jet ski, half submerged. He circled once, scanning. There. A faint movement between swells. He killed the throttle at precisely the right second, and let momentum glide him close enough to see a hand break the surface before vanishing again. No wasted motion. He stripped off his outer jacket and secured the wheel with one practiced lock. Before the next wave crested, he dove. The cold hit like a punch to the ribs, but he moved through it cleanly, eyes open against salt sting. Visibility was low. Debris drifted like slow knives in the water. He tracked the direction of the last movement and found her tangled in the jet ski's tow line, unconscious, pulled under by weight and current. Lila Ashbourne. He didn't hesitate. One hand stabilized her chin above water, while the other reached for the dive knife clipped discreetly at his belt. The old blade he'd installed days earlier without explanation. One precise slice. The line fell away. He surfaced with her just as a wave slammed into the breakwater, the sound cracking through air and bone. On the marina pier, Maris Ashbourne saw him rise from the swell carrying her daughter. The crowd gasped, not at drama, but at impossibility. He maneuvered them back to the boat with controlled urgency, hauling Lila aboard with careful efficiency. He assessed airway, pulse, breathing. Cleared obstruction. Rolled her onto her side as water spilled from her lungs. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, voice steady, not desperate. He compressed once. Twice. She coughed. The sound cut through storm noise sharper than any siren. Behind him, the Coast Guard cutter roared into view but slowed quickly at the shoals. Too deep. Rowan signaled with a tight hand gesture, guiding them to hold position where depth allowed. He restarted his engine and navigated outward at a diagonal angle that skirted the worst turbulence, using the same narrow channel he'd memorized years ago from charts most recreational boaters never studied. When he reached safe depth, Coast Guard crew transferred Lila aboard with urgent precision. Commander Iris Valdez stood at the rail, studying Rowan closely. Her gaze lingered not on the boat, but on him. "You certified for open water rescue?" she called over wind. Rowan shook his head once. "No." She didn't look convinced. They secured Lila and sped toward harbor medical staging. Rowan cut his engine and let silence fill the space where adrenaline had been. The storm continued its assault, but inside him, everything slowed. He turned back toward the marina. As he approached, the pier crowd parted without instruction. No laughter now. Only stunned quiet. Maris stood at the edge, soaked by spray, her white blazer clinging to her shoulders. For a moment, she looked less like a board chair and more like a mother who'd nearly lost everything. Rowan secured his line and stepped onto the dock. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. He didn't wait for gratitude. "Water's still rising," he said calmly. Move your vessels off the inner slips or they'll collide when the surge rebounds. It wasn't a suggestion, it was advice. She nodded once, instinctively obeying. Security guards who'd escorted him days ago now stared at him like they were seeing someone entirely different. Calder jogged up, breathless. Coast Guard says she's stable. Mild hypothermia, concussion, but she's breathing on her own. Rowan exhaled slowly. Across the pier, someone whispered, "How did he even know where to look?" Maris found her voice at last. You were lucky." Rowan met her eyes not unkindly. "No," he said quietly, "prepared." The word landed heavier than accusation. Wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of brine and something else. Shift. For the first time since he'd arrived at this harbor, power wasn't looking down at him. It was trying to understand him. And somewhere behind the shock settling over the marina, a different kind of storm was just beginning to form. The storm hadn't finished with the harbor. Rowan was still coiling his line when another shout tore across the pier. A 40-foot cruiser had broken loose from its inner slip, surge slamming it sideways into two neighboring hulls. Fiberglass cracked like gunfire. "Lines! Secure the lines!" someone yelled, panic replacing polish entirely. Maris turned in frantic circles, issuing orders no one seemed able to execute fast enough. Her heels slipped against soaked wood. The image of control she'd worn like armor was dissolving by the minute. Rowan didn't hesitate. He moved. "Shift weight starboard!" He barked to a crew struggling against the surge. "Don't pull against it. Angle with it." They obeyed without questioning why. He vaulted onto the unstable dock edge and retied a drifting stern line with swift, practiced knots that locked under tension. Another wave hit, but this time the cruiser held. "Who put cleats that close to the edge?" he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Maris heard him. "Can you stabilize the outer slips?" she demanded, voice cracking despite her effort to sound composed. He studied the water pattern for 2 seconds. "Not with current this strong. You need to release pressure first." "Release? How?" "Loosen forward lines before they snap and take the posts with them." Her silence told him she'd never considered that possibility. He moved again, instructing deckhands who just hours ago wouldn't have met his eyes. Across the marina, another vessel slammed into its neighbor. Metal shrieked. Someone screamed. Rowan scanned for hazards automatically. Fuel lines, electrical cables exposed, unsecured batteries. "Kill shore power on Dock C," he shouted toward Calder, who had reappeared with wide eyes. "Now!" Calder ran. The chaos intensified. Wealth couldn't command tide or wind, it could only react. Rowan climbed onto a pitching dock segment and secured 3 separate boats in under a minute. Movements fluid and efficient. Even soaked and battered by spray, he wasted nothing. Maris stepped closer this time, not staying at the boundary of the labor zone. "How do you know all this?" she asked, voice stripped of superiority. He tightened the final knot before answering. "You learn when you don't have backups." The statement hung heavier than accusation. Another loud crack split the air. One of the decorative regatta banners had torn free and wrapped itself around a spinning propeller. The motor screamed in protest. Rowan swore softly. "Shut it down!" Crew members scrambled. For the first time, people were looking at him not as intrusion, but direction. He guided them through quick, decisive corrections, redistributing weight, loosening lines before tension turned them lethal. Somewhere in the blur of motion, someone said, "He saved the girl." Another voice responded, "And now he's saving half the marina." The shift in tone was unmistakable. Before we go further, subscribe with the bell on, because this isn't just about one rescue. It's about what happens when preparation outpaces privilege. A Coast Guard truck rolled into the marina lot as the worst of the surge began to taper. Commander Valdez stepped out, scanning damage with trained eyes. She approached Rowan directly. "You navigated the shoals like you had a chart memorized," she said. Not a question. Rowan wiped salt water from his brow. "Spent time around them." "Doing what?" He hesitated only briefly. "Work." Valdez studied the reinforced bow of his boat. The dive knife clipped back into place. The calm breathing of a man who had never once looked surprised by chaos. "You weren't guessing out there," she said quietly. "No." Maris stepped in. "Commander, I assure you the marina will cooperate fully with—" Valdez raised a hand gently, silencing her without disrespect. Her focus remained on Rowan. "You cut the tow line underwater," she continued. "In low visibility, that's not recreational skill." He didn't answer. The wind finally began to ease, leaving behind debris and silence thick as fog. Valdez's gaze sharpened slightly. "We'll need a statement." Rowan nodded once. As emergency crews stabilized the remaining slips, whispers moved through the gathered members like tide under sand. Condemned boat, SingleDad, saved her. Rowan turned toward the municipal ramp where Elliot waited. The boy ran forward before he reached him, wrapping both arms around his soaked jacket without caring about cold or witnesses. "You did it," Elliot breathed. Rowan crouched to his son's level. "We did," he corrected gently. Behind them, Maris watched that exchange with something new in her expression. Not gratitude, not yet, recognition. And perhaps the first uncomfortable awareness that the man she'd laughed at was not what she thought. As Rowan guided Elliot toward the truck, Commander Valdez made a quiet call from beside the Coast Guard vehicle. "Yes," she said into the phone. "Run the name, Rowan Hale." A pause, then softer. "That's what I thought." The storm clouds thinned overhead, but tension lingered in the harbor air. Because the sea had exposed more than weak dock lines. It had exposed truth. And truth, once surfaced, doesn't sink quietly. Truth didn't wait for calm weather. Rowan had just wrapped a blanket around Elliot inside the truck when Commander Valdez approached again, tablet in hand, rainwater still dripping from the brim of her cap. "Rowan Hale," she said evenly, not loudly, but loud enough that Maris, who stood only yards away, could hear. "Former Navy rescue diver. Maritime structural engineer. 2 commendations for shallow water extraction operations." The words landed heavier than the storm surge. Elliot looked up at his father, eyes wide but not confused, more like pieces clicking into place. Rowan exhaled slowly. "That was a long time ago." Valdez tilted her head slightly. "Skill doesn't expire." Behind them, the marina crowd stilled. Conversations cut mid-sentence. Even the clink of loose rigging seemed to hush. Maris stepped forward, water still soaking her blazer. "Is that accurate?" she asked, though the answer was already in Valdez's posture. "Yes," Valdez replied. "And if he hadn't recognized the shoal shift pattern, your daughter would still be out there." The implication wasn't cruel, it was factual. Rowan shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the direction of attention. "She's stable," he said quietly. "That's what matters." Valdez studied him for a long second. "We're filing a formal commendation." "That's not necessary." "It is." Maris swallowed, her composure fraying at the edges. "Mr. Hale, Rowan, I may have misjudged." He didn't let her finish. "You judged what you saw," he said calmly. "That's how this place works." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Elliot tugged lightly at his father's sleeve. "You were in the Navy?" Rowan crouched again, lowering himself to eye level. Yeah. Why didn't you tell me? He hesitated. The truth sat heavier than metals ever had. Because it's not who I am now, he said. Now I'm your dad. Elliot considered that, then nodded once, satisfied. Around them, the marina members began to murmur again. This time, not in mockery, but in uneasy recalibration. The condemned boat wasn't scrap. It was engineered. Maris stepped closer, voice softer now. You reinforced the hull intentionally for shoal impact, didn't you? Yes. You expected a storm. I expect storms, he replied. Valdez's radio crackled, confirming Lila was conscious and asking for her mother. Maris closed her eyes briefly, emotion finally overtaking posture. When she opened them again, the arrogance that once defined her tone was gone. I owe you my daughter's life, she said. Rowan didn't respond immediately. He glanced toward the marina slips where workers were still repairing snapped lines under Calder's supervision. You owe them better dock safety protocols, he said finally. And you owe your staff respect. The crowd heard it. Maris heard it. Valdez didn't interrupt. The authority dynamic had shifted without shouting, without spectacle. Maris straightened slowly. You're right. It was simple, but it was public. The words spread through the dock like electricity. Santi approached, wiping grease from his hands. Didn't think you were just a dock mechanic, he muttered with a half-smile. Rowan returned the smallest hint of one. I am. The statement wasn't denial, it was ownership. Valdez stepped back, preparing to leave. We'll be in touch regarding the commendation ceremony, she said. Official recognition. Rowan stiffened slightly at that. I'd rather not make it a spectacle. That choice isn't entirely yours anymore, she replied gently. As Coast Guard vehicles began to depart, members of the Marina Board gathered around Maris, whispering urgently. Insurance liabilities, structural damage, public image. For once, she wasn't leading the conversation. She was listening. Rowan loaded tools back into the truck bed, movement steady, unhurried. Elliot helped without being asked. Are they going to stop laughing now? The boy asked quietly. Rowan closed the tailgate. Maybe. And if they don't? He met his son's eyes. Then it doesn't matter. Across the lot, Maris broke away from the board cluster and walked toward him one final time before he could leave. The municipal ramp is unsafe long-term, she said carefully. You can berth at slip 12 temporarily, no fees. Rowan considered the offer, not charity, correction. I'll pay standard rate, he said, when I can. Her lips pressed together, but she nodded. Fair. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't friendship, it was adjustment. As Rowan drove away, the marina behind him looked different. Not in structure, but in awareness. Word would spread. Not about humiliation, about competence, about a man in oil-stained gloves who had navigated where polished hulls couldn't. Inside the truck, Elliot stared out at the water thoughtfully. Dad? Yeah? When I grow up, can I learn to read the sea like that? Rowan glanced at him, something warm breaking through the fatigue in his chest. Yeah, he said softly. I'll teach you. Behind them, Maris Ashbourne stood at the edge of the pier, watching the truck disappear down the coastal road. For the first time, she wasn't calculating profit margins or membership tiers. She was recalculating people, and that shift would matter more than the storm ever could. The truck's taillights faded from the marina entrance, but the ripple he'd left behind didn't. By the time Rowan reached the small rental house near the shoreline, a word had already begun circulating through harbor group chats and private member threads. Not gossip this time, video clips. grainy footage of him diving into the shoals, screenshots of Coast Guard confirmation, a still image of Maris Ashbourne standing speechless on her own pier. Inside the house, the world felt smaller, quieter. Elliot dropped onto the couch, exhausted but buzzing with pride. "They were all staring at you," he said. Rowan hung his soaked jacket by the door. "Storms make people stare." "That's not what I meant." He paused, glancing at his son. The boy's expression wasn't hero worship, it was understanding. Rowan walked into the kitchen and filled 2 glasses of water. His hands were steady again, though his muscles hummed with leftover adrenaline. A knock came at the door. He stiffened slightly. When he opened it, and Calder stood there, cap in hand. "Sorry to show up like this," the trainee said, "but I had to see if you were okay." "We're fine," Rowan replied. Calder hesitated. "The board's meeting tomorrow morning. Emergency session, damage control." Rowan leaned against the doorframe. "That's their job." Maris asked for a full safety audit, structural review, dock redesign proposals. Calder's eyes held something close to admiration. "She used your terminology." Rowan exhaled through his nose. "Good." Calder shifted awkwardly. "You could consult. They'd listen now." He shook his head. "I've got work." That was true in more ways than one. Calder nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, you changed how they see this place." Rowan didn't answer that. After the trainee left, Elliot approached quietly. "Are you mad at her?" Rowan thought about Maris standing soaked and shaken on the dock, about the difference between arrogance and fear. "No," he said finally, "I'm not mad." "Then what? I'm careful." The next morning, the marina looked different. Not repaired yet, but humbled. Rowan returned early to check his boat at Slip 12, the temporary berth Maris had offered. Crew members nodded at him now. Some even offered quiet thanks. He acknowledged them with small nods back. The boat sat steady against the dock, reinforced bow catching early light. It no longer looked condemned. It looked deliberate. Santi approached with coffee in hand. "You see the news?" Rowan frowned slightly. "What news?" "Local station picked it up. Dock worker rescues developer's daughter." He winced at the phrasing. Santi smirked. "They don't know the half of it." Rowan climbed aboard to recheck the bilge pump. "They don't need to." Across the marina, a black sedan pulled in. Maris stepped out, not in white this time, navy jacket, hair pulled back, no entourage. She walked straight toward him. Conversation softened as she passed. "Rowan," she said once she reached the slip. He stepped down from the deck. "Chairwoman." She didn't correct him. "I reviewed the damage reports," she began. "Your instructions prevented at least 3 structural failures." He didn't look surprised. "I was wrong," she continued. "About you, about what matters." The words were measured, but they weren't forced. He studied her for a moment, gauging sincerity. "Storms level things," he said quietly. "Sometimes that's useful." A faint, almost humorless smile touched her lips. "The board wants to host a recognition ceremony, publicly." "I don't need applause." "It's not about applause," she replied. "It's about correction." He considered that. Around them, dock hands worked with renewed energy, as if something unspoken had shifted in their favor. Maris took a breath. "I also want to implement mandatory safety revisions. I'd like your input." There it was, not charity, not guilt. Invitation. Rowan looked out over the water, thinking about how quickly status could flip under pressure. "I'll give suggestions," he said. "No titles." She nodded. "Agreed." A silence stretched between them, not hostile, but recalibrating. You saved my daughter, she added more softly. I did my job, he replied. You don't work for this marina. He met her gaze evenly. I work for whoever's in the water. The simplicity of it seemed to settle something inside her. As she turned to leave, Elliot jogged down the dock carrying a small toolkit. Dad, you forgot the wrench. Maris paused, watching father and son interact with unfiltered ease. Slip 12 suits you, she said quietly before walking away. Rowan climbed back aboard and tightened a bracket that didn't really need tightening. Elliot grinned up at him. They're not laughing. No, Rowan agreed, but he knew something deeper had shifted than laughter. Power had seen competence in oil-stained gloves, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Power didn't disappear overnight. It was reorganized. By midweek, Slip 12 had become a quiet landmark. Not flashy, not elevated, just steady. Rowan worked with the same focus he always had, adjusting wiring harnesses and reinforcing deck joints as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Marina staff now asked for his opinion before securing storm lines. Harbor patrol trainees lingered longer near his berth. Even yacht owners nodded with something resembling respect instead of dismissal. He didn't encourage it. He didn't reject it either. He just worked. Santi leaned over the railing mid-morning. Board, finalize the ceremony, he said. Saturday, public. Rowan tightened a bolt without looking up. Thought I said I didn't need one. You don't, Santi replied. They do. That part was harder to argue. Across the dock, Maris stood with the two contractors reviewing blueprint drafts. She gestured toward the inner slips, her tone direct but no longer dismissive. Rowan caught fragments of conversation. Cleat spacing revisions, I'll load bearing reinforcements, emergency release protocols, his terminology, not borrowed, adopted. Elliot sat cross-legged near the bow, sketching the boat in a small notebook. Are you going to wear a suit? He asked, casually. Rowan glanced down at his grease-stained shirt. Probably not. You should. Why? Because they expect one. He paused, considering the boy's logic. Before we move further, subscribe with the bell on, because what's coming isn't about applause. It's about what happens when the overlooked become unavoidable. Saturday arrived with clear skies. The pier was dressed differently this time. Not in regatta banners, but in a modest podium and Coast Guard insignia. Cameras from local news stations dotted the edges. Members gathered, not in mockery, but anticipation. Rowan almost didn't come. He stood at home that morning holding an ironed shirt he rarely wore. Elliot stood beside him, hands in pockets. You don't like attention, the boy said. No, but sometimes attention fixes things. The simplicity of that hit harder than any speech. Rowan exhaled and put the shirt on. When they arrived at the marina, conversations paused. Not dramatically, but respectfully. Slip 12 lay behind them, quiet as ever. Commander Valdez stood near the podium, formal uniform crisp. Maris waited beside her, posture composed but different now, less performative, more present. Calder spotted them first and gave a small nod. The ceremony began without spectacle. Valdez stepped forward. Last week, during severe coastal conditions, a civilian vessel executed a rescue maneuver in shallow debris-laden waters that exceeded standard response capability. Her gaze lifted to Rowan. Rowan Hale demonstrated precision consistent with advanced maritime training, resulting in the successful recovery of a miner in critical conditions. Murmurs moved through the crowd, not gossip but validation. Valdez continued. He did so without hesitation, without request for compensation, and without regard for status. The last word lingered. Maris stepped up next. "I misjudged a man based on appearances," she said plainly. "That mistake could have cost my daughter her life." No defensiveness, no excuses. Rowan felt Elliot's shoulder brush lightly against his side. "The marina will be implementing permanent safety revisions informed by Mr. Hale's recommendations," Maris added. "Effective immediately." That part mattered more than any plaque. Valdez presented a framed commendation. Rowan accepted it with both hands, not lifting it high, not posing. Camera shutters clicked. For a brief second, the image captured wasn't a hero basking in victory. It was a father standing steady. Applause followed, not thunderous but genuine. Rowan stepped to the podium only because silence required him to. "I don't need recognition," he said simply. "But docks need better safety. Water doesn't care who owns what." He paused, scanning faces that once held laughter. Preparation beats pride. He stepped back. No grand speech, no performance, just truth. As the crowd dispersed, Santi clapped him once on the back. Not bad for a dock mechanic. Rowan gave him a sideways glance. "Still am." Maris approached one final time after cameras packed up. "Slip 12 is permanent," she said quietly. "Standard rate, no exceptions." He nodded. "Fair." She extended her hand. This time he shook it. Not as charity, as equals. Elliot tugged at his sleeve once they were alone again. That wasn't scary at all. Rowan looked down at him. "Storms are scarier." They walked back toward the boat together, the framed commendation tucked under Elliot's arm like fragile treasure. Around them, dock hands worked with lighter shoulders. Harbor Patrol trainees practiced knots more carefully. Even yacht owners checked their lines twice. The marina hadn't changed structure. It had changed culture. And that shift, quiet, practical, irreversible, was the real victory. The applause faded, but the work didn't. By Monday morning, Rowan was back beneath the deck at Slip 12, replacing a corroded junction box while Elliot handed him tools without being asked. The framed commendation sat inside the truck, not on display. Recognition hadn't altered routine. What had changed was the traffic. 2 marina contractors approached mid-morning carrying revised dock schematics. "Chairwoman asked us to run these by you," one said, unrolling blueprints across an overturned crate. Rowan wiped his hands and scanned the plans. Cleat placements had been widened. Emergency quick-release systems added. Reinforcement points recalculated for surge impact. He nodded once. "Shift this brace 6 inches inland. Surge torque will snap it otherwise." They marked the change immediately. No debate. Across the harbor, Calder supervised trainees practicing storm drills with renewed seriousness, and the difference was visible. Less performance, more precision. Rowan stepped back aboard his boat, checking the bilge again. Habit. Always habit. Elliot leaned on the railing. "They're listening to you. For now." Why for now? Rowan considered that. People listen loudest right after they're scared. The boy absorbed it quietly. A sleek black SUV rolled into the lot near noon. Not for ceremony this time, just arrival. Maris stepped out alone. She crossed the dock without entourage, carrying a folder instead of authority. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. He climbed down to meet her. "Sure." She opened the folder, revealing finalized marina policy revisions. Safety audits mandatory. Storm readiness certification required. Emergency response collaboration with Coast Guard formalized. "These pass tonight," she said. "Unanimous support." Rowan studied the pages. "Good." She hesitated before continuing. "There's something else." He waited. My daughter asked about you." His expression didn't change. "She remembers you underwater," Maris said softly. "She said you looked calm." Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. Panic spreads. "She wants to thank you personally." "That's not necessary." Maris met his gaze. "It matters to her." A pause settled between them. "I'll stop by the hospital," he said finally. "Briefly." Relief flickered across her face, subtle but genuine. As she turned to leave, she stopped again. "You were right. About respect." The word held weight now. When she walked away, the marina didn't part out of fear. It parted out of acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, Rowan and Elliot drove to the hospital overlooking the harbor. The building smelled sterile and distant from salt air, but through the upper windows water remained visible, a reminder of how thin the line had been. Lila Ashbourne sat upright in bed, pale but alert. A bandage traced her temple. When Rowan entered, she studied him with quiet intensity. "You didn't look scared," she said. He offered a small shrug. "You were." She smiled faintly. "I couldn't move." "I know." Elliot stood beside his father, awkward but proud. "Thank you," Lila said simply. Rowan nodded. "Next time, check tide charts before heading past the markers." She laughed softly, wincing at the motion. Maris watched from the corner, eyes reflecting something that hadn't existed before. Humility without humiliation. The visit was short. No photographs, no speeches, just closure. On the drive back, Elliot stared out the window at passing shoreline. "Are we done now?" he asked. Rowan thought about that. The boat was secure. The policies were changing. The laughter was gone. But storms would come again. "Not done," he said. "Just ready." That evening, Slip 12 caught the sunset differently than the luxury slips once had. No longer isolated, no longer overlooked. Santi joined him on the dock, handing over a cup of coffee. "You realize," Santi said, "you're part of this place now." Rowan took a slow sip. "I always was." The difference was visibility. Lights flickered on across the marina as dusk settled. Boats rocked gently in calmer water, secured more thoughtfully than before. Calder jogged past, nodding in greeting. Board members no longer whispered when he walked by. They asked questions, and he answered. Not as a former officer, not as a hero, just as a man who understood the sea. Elliot climbed aboard and ran a hand along the reinforced bow. "It doesn't look broken anymore." Rowan followed his gaze. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." The condemned tag was gone. In its place was something sturdier than pride. Proof. Proof that quiet competence outlasts ridicule. Proof that preparation reshapes power. And proof that sometimes the place meant for labor becomes the place that leads. Even with policies rewritten and applause behind them, power didn't surrender its habits easily. The emergency board meeting that evening wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. Rowan hadn't planned to attend, but Calder had stopped by Slip 12 just before dusk. "You should hear this," he'd said quietly. "Some members aren't thrilled." So now Rowan stood at the back of the marina conference room, oil-stained boots on polished tile, Elliot beside him with a notebook in hand. The contrast hadn't disappeared, it had simply moved indoors. Maris sat at the head of the long glass table. Around her, board members shifted in tailored jackets, flipping through printed copies of the proposed safety revisions. One man cleared his throat. "These upgrades are expensive. Mandatory audits, reinforced cleats, emergency override systems. We're not a Coast Guard station." Maris didn't flinch. "We nearly lost a life. That was an anomaly." Rowan felt Elliot tense beside him. Another member chimed in, and bringing in outside consultation, dock mechanics influencing policy, it sets a precedent. There it was. Status protecting itself. Maris folded her hands calmly. Competence sets precedent. A few glances shifted toward the back of the room. Rowan didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The first board member leaned back. We appreciate what he did, but emotion can't dictate long-term infrastructure. Maris's voice sharpened slightly. Physics dictates infrastructure, and he understands it. Silence settled thickly. Rowan finally spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Surge torque at inner slip C exceeded tolerance by 12% last week, he said evenly. Your current cleat spacing can't absorb that load during rebound. Several board members blinked. He continued, calm and exact. If you don't adjust brace alignment, the next storm won't crack fiberglass, it'll rip posts out entirely. No raised voice. No embellishment. Just fact. A woman across the table frowned at her papers. How would you know the exact torque variance? Rowan met her gaze without hostility. Because I measured it. Murmurs rippled. He hadn't sought authority. He'd gathered data. Maris allowed the silence to work before speaking again. We can debate pride, she said, or we can prevent damage. The earlier dissenter sighed. Fine, vote. Hands rose slowly at first, then all at once. Unanimous. Rowan felt Elliot's small hand tighten briefly around his sleeve. As the meeting adjourned, several board members approached him, not with condescension, but with cautious respect. You're certain about the brace adjustment? One asked. Yes. And the quick release protocol? Essential. They nodded, jotting notes. The room's energy had shifted. Not dramatically, but decisively. Maris stepped away from the table once the others dispersed. You didn't have to speak, she said. He shrugged lightly. Didn't want to. But you did. He looked toward Elliot, who was sketching dock beams in the margin of his notebook. Sometimes silence costs more, Rowan replied. Maris studied him for a long second. You don't want a board seat? It wasn't a question. No. Why? Because I'm not here to rule the marina. Her lips curved faintly. Just fix it. Just fix it. Outside, night air cooled the tension lingering from inside. The docks creaked softly, boats secured under newly tightened lines. Elliot looked up at his father. You didn't look nervous. I was. You didn't show it. Rowan crouched beside him. You don't always need to show everything you feel. The boy nodded thoughtfully. As they walked toward slip 12, Santi called out from the shadows. Heard the vote passed. Yeah, Santi grinned. Guess the dock mechanic runs the place now. Rowan shook his head. No, the storm does. Laughter, genuine this time, drifted across the pier. For the first time since he'd arrived weeks ago with a condemned hull and folded receipt, Rowan felt something different settle in his chest. Not victory, stability. Power had tried to dismiss him. Then it had tried to contain him. Now it had adjusted around him. He stepped aboard his boat and ran a hand along the reinforced bow once more. The metal felt cool under his palm, solid, unbothered by opinion. Elliot climbed up beside him. Are they finally done underestimating you? The boy asked. Rowan looked out across the dark harbor, where lights reflected steady against calmer water. They're done underestimating the sea, he said quietly. And that was enough. The marina didn't return to normal. It recalibrated. By the following week, new cleats were being installed along Dock C. Contractors reinforced brace alignments exactly where Rowan had marked them. Emergency quick-release kits arrived in sealed crates stamped with Coast Guard approval numbers. Slip 12 remained quiet, but no longer invisible. Rowan was tightening a fuel filter when a familiar Coast Guard SUV rolled into the lot again. Not urgent, not flashing. Deliberate. Elliot noticed first. Commander's back. Rowan wiped his hands slowly, watching as Commander Iris Valdez stepped out in full-dress uniform this time. That meant something. Maris appeared moments later, moving quickly but without panic. Word spread fast along the pier. Dockhands paused mid-task. Yacht owners drifted closer without pretending not to. Valdez approached Rowan directly. "Mr. Hale," she began formally, voice carrying just enough to gather attention. "We received final clearance from District Command." Rowan folded his arms lightly. Clearance for what? For public recognition beyond this marina. Murmurs traveled like wind along the slips. Valdez continued, "Your actions qualify for the Civilian Maritime Valor Commendation. It's rare." Rowan's expression didn't change. Inside, something tightened. Not pride, not fear, but discomfort with scale. "That won't be necessary," he said quietly. Valdez met his gaze steadily. "It already is." Maris stood beside her, not speaking, simply allowing the moment to unfold without claiming it. Valdez turned slightly toward the gathered crowd. "During the storm, Mr. Hale executed a shallow water extraction under conditions our primary vessel could not safely navigate. He assessed tide variance, identified submerged hazard patterns, and performed underwater line severance with professional precision. The technical clarity silenced any lingering doubt. He did so before we arrived," she added, "which means he acted without guarantee of backup." The weight of that hung heavy. Rowan shifted slightly, aware of Elliot standing at his side, looking up at him not with awe, but with steady trust. Valdez held out a second framed citation, this one bearing federal insignia. "This commendation will be filed with district records." He accepted it with the same restraint as before. No raised hands, no performance. The crowd began clapping again, but this time it wasn't hesitant. It was unified. Even board members who had argued cost projections days earlier joined in without reservation. Maris stepped forward once the applause softened. "There's one more thing," she said. "The marina will be funding a community maritime safety workshop series, free to local families." She glanced at Rowan. "If you're willing to lead the first session." He blinked, genuinely surprised. "I'm not a lecturer." "You're an example," she replied. A ripple of agreement moved through the dockhands. Santi called out from behind, "I'll attend." Calder raised a hand. "Me too." Rowan looked at Elliot. The boy grinned. "You'd be good at it." For a long moment, Rowan studied the water beyond the pier. The same water that had nearly taken a life, the same water that had revealed more than pride ever could. "Fine," he said at last. "One session." Valdez allowed herself a faint smile. Maris extended her hand again, not ceremonially this time, but in partnership. He shook it. Not because she'd changed completely, but because she was trying. As the crowd dispersed, conversations carried a different tone. No one mentioned the condemned tag anymore. No one joked about rust or receipts. Instead, they spoke about brace angles, tide charts, redundancy systems, about preparation. Elliot tugged at his father's sleeve once they were alone near the bow. "Does this mean we're staying?" he asked. Rowan looked around the marina, the reinforced docks, the workers adjusting lines with new awareness, the board chair speaking to contractors without condescension. "Yeah," he said softly, "we're staying." The wind carried no storm warning that afternoon, and only steady salt air and the hum of work being done right. Commander Valdez returned to her vehicle, pausing once to glance back at slip 12. She didn't see a dock mechanic. She saw a man who'd stepped forward when authority couldn't, and she knew something most of the marina was just beginning to understand. True leadership doesn't announce itself. It responds. Rowan climbed aboard his boat and checked the anchor chain out of habit. Elliot followed, mimicking each motion carefully. On the main pier, Maris watched them for a moment before turning back toward the board office. Not above them anymore, not separate, but part of the same tide. Respect had replaced ridicule. Policy had replaced pride. And the place meant for labor had quietly become the place that led. The first maritime safety workshop filled faster than anyone expected. Families from the marina stood beside local fishermen who'd never once been invited past the outer gates. Dock hands lined up next to yacht owners. Teenagers who'd once treated the breakwater like a photo backdrop now held printed tide charts in their hands. Rowan stood at the front of the pier, not behind a podium, just beside his boat. Slip 12. The place they'd laughed at. He didn't wear a suit. He wore the same oil-stained gloves. Storm doesn't care what you paid for your boat, he began evenly. It cares how you secured it. No theatrics, no grand gestures, just the truth. Elliot moved through the small crowd, handing out laminated safety checklists he'd helped design. His handwriting marked the margins. Always double-check knots, circled twice. Maris stood off to the side, not directing, not controlling. Listening. When Rowan demonstrated how to read subtle current shifts by watching debris patterns instead of wave height, even seasoned boat owners leaned in. Calder assisted with equipment placement, repeating instructions Rowan had once given him mid-storm. Something had changed in the marina. Not surface level, structural. After the workshop ended, families lingered longer than expected. Questions replaced assumptions. Conversations crossed social lines that had once felt permanent. A retired fisherman shook Rowan's hand. "You made this place safer," he said quietly. Rowan shook his head once. "We did." As dusk approached, the crowd dispersed slowly. Slip 12 returned to calm. Elliot climbed aboard and sat on the reinforced bow, running his fingers along the metal plating. "Remember when they called it junk?" he asked. Rowan leaned against the railing. "Yeah. It doesn't look like junk anymore." "No, because it never was." Maris approached without announcement, hands tucked into her jacket pockets. "The safety compliance report came back," she said. "Insurance premiums dropped 20%. Rowan smirked faintly. Preparation pays. She studied the boat for a long moment. "I'm glad you didn't leave." He looked at her evenly. "I wasn't planning to." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not tense, not performative, just balanced. Out beyond the harbor, water moved in steady rhythm against the breakwater that had once nearly taken everything. Rowan stepped onto the dock and glanced at the line of slips stretching outward. Workers moved with intention now. Yacht owners secured gear without being reminded. Harbor patrol trainees drilled regularly without complaint. The culture had shifted, and it hadn't required force. Just example. Elliot hopped down beside him. "What injustice are we fixing next?" the boy asked lightly. Rowan chuckled under his breath. "One at a time." The framed commendations still rested in the truck. Not mounted, not displayed, because the real proof wasn't paper. It was in the reinforced braces, the widened cleats, the quiet respect woven into everyday routine. They laughed when the single dad bought a broken boat. Weeks later, the Coast Guard knocked on his door. But the real reversal wasn't the knock. It was what came after. A marina that once measured worth by polish now measured it by preparedness. A chairwoman who once guarded status now guarded safety. A boy who once watched his father endure ridicule now watched him reshape a community without raising his voice. Rowan rested his hand on Elliot's shoulder. "This wasn't about them laughing," he said softly. "It was about not quitting." The harbor lights flickered on one by one, reflecting steady across calm water. Power hadn't been destroyed, it had been corrected, and correction, done right, lasts longer than applause. If you've got the next story title, tell me what it is. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Your kid doesn't belong here. The school board. Told a single dad, then the room went quiet. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?